Amanita Muscaria, or fly agaric. The Super Mario-esque mushroom is something of an enigma in our popular culture. Is it a magic mushroom or a psychedelic mushroom? Is it poisonous? How does it relate to drinking someone else's piss? Well, today we're going to address all of these questions and then some more. First, let's look at what Amanita Muscaria actually is from a pure biology standpoint. I use fly agaric and Amanita interchangeably throughout this video, so please be aware of that moving forward. As many know, it has a small red or orange cap, with small white parts on top of it. During heavy rain, these white plaques can wash off, causing it to look like an edible mushroom, Amanita caesaria, or Caesar's mushroom. Since fly agaric is not edible in any conventional, normal usage of the word edible, this misidentification can be pretty bad and kind of dangerous. The name comes from the fact that this mushroom was once used to catch flies, as the compounds in the mushroom are toxic to insects, and depending on your point of view, to humans too. So where does it come from? Fly agaric is native to Europe and Asia, which encompasses a lot of the world, so not very specific. It has a large range, and it was spread to the New World, not actually by humans or Europeans, but across the frozen Bering Strait into North America. It generally occurs in temperate northern latitudes, in forests, pastures, and fields. The mushroom contains a number of psychoactive compounds, which we're going to discuss in detail later. But when consumed whole, fly agaric is essentially poisonous. Later, we're going to get into how it was consumed for religious and recreational purposes, but for now, just know if you consume one, you're going to get sick. Fly agaric is also a mycorrhizae, meaning it is a fungus with a symbiotic relationship with a plant. In this case, that plant is typically a tree. Birch trees, pines, spruces are all good candidates. Fly agaric needs a tree in order to survive, as it taps the tree's roots to obtain its nutrients. It cannot grow without a tree. That's one reason why fly agaric is very seldomly cultivated indoors, because proper conditions for fruiting it are nearly impossible. It's not like an oyster mushroom or like a psilocybin mushroom where you can grow it in your little Uncle Ben's and make a monotub. It needs tree roots, and the roots of fairly mature trees at that, which most people do not have in their homes. Anyway, what happens if you eat one of these? Well, the effects begin to kick in about 30 to 120 minutes after, and they typically manifest as central nervous system symptoms, so confusion, dizziness, agitation, ataxia, or a loss of coordination, visual and auditory perceptual changes, space distortion, and disruption in the sense of time. There can also be increased or decreased heart rate and elevated blood pressure. And you're probably thinking, how is it increasing and decreasing heart rate? We will get to that, but there's a lot of stuff in this mushroom, and they don't all do the same thing. Notably, gastrointestinal symptoms like nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea are actually pretty uncommon. When we discuss the biological mechanisms at play, this is going to make a little bit more sense, but this is in contrast to psilocybin-containing mushrooms, which famously make you vomit and cause nausea. In fact, looking at the North American Mycological Association, we see that most mushroom poisonings have GI-related symptoms. So off the bat, we're seeing something that's a little bit atypical as far as mushroom poisoning or mushroom effects go. Fly agaric can induce a coma and cause death, but this is a rare phenomenon. Typically, the effects will last about 8 to 24 hours. Typically, treatment is conservative depending on the symptoms that manifest. Interestingly, fly agaric poisoning can result in both anticholinergic and cholinergic symptoms, another unusual feature of this mushroom. This is in reference to how they act on the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Anticholinergics reduce the effect of acetylcholine, and cholinergics increase the effect of acetylcholine. So what this means in practice is that the same medical treatment may not work for two different patients. A patient with anticholinergic symptoms of restlessness may benefit from a benzodiazepine, like Xanax, whereas a patient with cholinergic symptoms would be at risk of respiratory depression or not breathing if the same benzo was administered, because now you're taking two things that restrict your breathing. On the whole, fly agaric is a very distinctive mushroom that can be accidentally ingested by children or those mistaking it for another species. The poisoning it induces, while certainly distressing, is typically not fatal with supportive treatment. Of course, medical, recreational, and traditional uses often do not have this mushroom consumed whole. So how has fly agaric been used throughout history? Our ancestors may not have had our modern scientific knowledge or our instruments, but they had intimate knowledge of the plants that they held in high medicinal and spiritual regard. They were as intelligent as we are today, and over time, they figured out ways to alter the effects of fly agaric to make it more desirable and less toxic. We'll get into the specific compounds later, but the main toxic compound of fly agaric is ibotenic acid, and the compound that creates desirable mental effects is called muscimol. All cultures that consume fly agaric developed crude methods of refinement that allowed them to reduce the amount of ibotenic acid they were consuming. And this is again a generalization. There are some effects of ibotenic acid that some people might like, but on the whole, the goal was typically to reduce ibotenic acid and increase muscimol. So how did they do this? I will now attempt to describe some of the cultures that consume this mushroom and their methods. Like a lot of things in the psychedelic realm, it can be hard to tell hype apart from history. So for that reason, I'm going to stick to well-established scientific knowledge, and I'm going to avoid going on tangents and speculation for the most part. So the most well-known culture to actually utilize fly agaric in shamanistic rituals are the indigenous people of East Siberia. So locals in East Siberia have taken fly agaric for thousands of years. For a long time, it was the only thing in the area that could get you high, because alcohol hadn't been introduced at the time they had begun using this mushroom. Shamans would connect to the spirits by inducing a hallucinogenic state, by using rhythmic drumming, and by consuming this mushroom. A common trope or belief you may have heard of is that people would also drink the shaman's piss in order to get completely blasted themselves. The main compounds in fly agaric are typically not extensively metabolized, and they're excreted mostly unchanged in urine, which means it goes into your body and most of it will just come right back out in your piss. So if you drink that piss, those compounds are still present and you can still get high off of someone else's piss if they consume the mushroom. But it's not just human piss that can bring on that magic. Reindeer piss can also suffice, and drinking reindeer piss, or in this case, you can just file them and scoop up the yellow snow, that can get you super high. They believe that drinking mushroom-infused urine provides a similar high with less unpleasant effects as compared to eating the raw mushroom yourself. For reasons we will get into soon, there's good reason to believe that this is actually true, and actually does mitigate the negative effect. And so we stumble across an axiomatic truth. It is always better the second time. So use of these mushrooms for mind-altering purposes is not limited to Siberia, and there are reports of its use in India, Europe, and other parts of the world. However, a full cultural analysis is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but if you want to look up how Amanita Muscaria or fly agaric may have been used in these cultures, there's some really interesting research and theories that have been produced. Another more recent piece of interesting fly agaric history is that it inspired the naming of the compound muscarine, and by extension the muscarinic system in the body, when Oswald Schmeiberg, I'm so sorry, I cannot pronounce German, but while Oswald Schmeiberg was experimenting on stimulation of the vagus nerve of the heart, he found that the compound now known as muscarine could produce the same effect on the heart as electrical stimulation. They hypothesized that this chemical was potentially released when the vagus nerve was stimulated. The name muscarine comes from, well, Amanita Muscaria, our beloved mushroom of the hour. The chemical responsible for this effect turned out to not be some endogenous muscarine, as in your body does not make muscarine. The actual neurotransmitter responsible made by your body is called acetylcholine. Still, the name lives on with a whole system of receptors named in part by muscarine, and these are called muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. Ironically, muscarine is actually not very abundant in fly agaric, and it's not one of our compounds of interest when we discuss its potential medicinal uses. So for a seldom discussed mushroom today, fly agaric has had an outsized scientific and cultural impact, but as we will see, its tale is not quite over yet, as fly agaric may be swept into the third wave psychedelic movement. So let's move on to the actual psychoactive compounds. What is in this mushroom that make you high, and make it a potential medicine and a potential toxin? There's a number of alkaloids in fly agaric that act on the body, but the main two we will be discussing are ibotenic acid and muscimol. Note that Amanita Muscaria has many different psychoactive compounds, many of which contribute to its effects in one way or another. For the scope of this video though, evaluating these two compounds will best help us understand its effects and some of the historical narratives surrounding the mushroom. So With that in mind, let's start with ibotenic acid. Ibotenic acid is a prodrug of muscimol. And what's a prodrug? A prodrug is just any compound, any substance, any drug that when metabolized turns into a different drug. So in this case, what that means is that when ibotenic acid is ingested by a human or reindeer, apparently, it is converted into muscimol. In this case, about 10 to 20% of ibotenic acid is converted into muscimol once it is ingested into the body. Some articles seem to state that ibotenic acid doesn't really have its own psychoactive effects, that it's only really just a prodrug for muscimol, which is having the real effect. This seems to be what Google AI thinks, or at least thought when I made this video. And that's almost certainly false. Modern studies show that ibotenic acid is pharmacologically active, and it's also far more toxic than muscimol. Pharmacologically, it's an agonist of NMDA glutamate receptors, and these are vital to memory, learning, and neuroplasticity. Because glutamate receptor activation is excitatory, meaning it excites neurons to pass messages to each other, it essentially speeds up the brain. This can be compared to NMDA antagonists, which slow the brain down by reducing excitatory transmission. A famous example of an NMDA antagonist is ketamine, although ketamine has a variety of pharmacological effects that are beyond the scope of this video. Okay, so we turn up the clock speed of the brain. What does this do, and why would that be bad? On the surface, it sounds like it might just make you smarter. Maybe to a certain extent, but having your neurons fire really fast, really often, is not good for them, and it leads to something called excitotoxicity. This basically means they're firing off so much that they are being damaged or killed in the process. By extension, ibotenic acid is neurotoxic because it can cause excitotoxicity. Studies on rats find that ibotenic acid can cause seizures and the development of lesions that can impair learning and memory. As you might expect, there is never really a good lesion to have in your nervous system, especially your brain. And anytime you start out by saying in rats, there's always a bit of a caveat. Rats are not humans, and most humans are not rats, except for maybe politicians. As stated earlier, Amanita Muscaria is very rarely lethal, so it seems that ibotenic acid, at least in the doses commonly encountered in fly agaric, is not immediately lethal. That being said, not immediately lethal is not the highest bar to try and surmount, where safety is concerned. So, ibotenic acid may contribute to the effects of fly agaric, including its hallucinatory properties through its actions on the glutamate system as we discussed. It's difficult to tell exactly what compounds cause which effects when the mushroom is consumed because there are a lot of compounds, and they may have overlapping symptoms. However, trends in cultural and recreational use indicate that ibotenic acid may carry many of the mushroom's unpleasant side effects. At this point, you're probably wondering why anyone would willingly consume this. That's because, as we discussed, there is another major psychoactive compound. This compound is called muscimol. As we mentioned, it is a metabolite of ibotenic acid, but it also exists in Amanita on its own. Muscimol's main pharmacological action is on GABA receptors, which in many ways are the opposite of NMDA receptors, as we have discussed. GABA receptors, when activated, inhibit neural firing. Activation of GABA receptors slows down the brain. It will often be described as the brakes of the brain or the nervous system. And generally speaking, people tend to find GABA activation or agonism quite pleasant. Perhaps the most well-known GABA agonist is alcohol. Many other compounds act on GABA, including benzodiazepines and GHB. If you Google a list of addictive drugs, many of them will be GABA agonists or positive allosteric modulators of GABA. That's not to say that muscimol is addictive or that Amanita Muscaria is addictive. It's not quite that simple. However, this may help you understand why this mushroom might be desirable to people, because with the exception of Datura and DPH or Benadryl users, most people doing these drugs are not doing them out of pure masochism. And I am sorry, Hatman, I still love you. Muscimol changes neurotransmitter levels in the brain and leads to an increase in serotonin and a decrease in catecholamines. While this effect cannot be discounted, it seems that the most pertinent action of muscimol is its agonism of GABA receptors, specifically its full agonism of GABA A and its partial agonism of GABA B. It's also a weak reuptake inhibitor of GABA. It's worth noting that muscimol's agonism at GABA A is very strong. It's so good at binding to GABA A that it is often used as a probe molecule for GABA A receptors and as a reference to compare other GABA A agonists to. This GABA-A agonism is responsible for its alcohol-like intoxicating effects. We've discussed what fly agaric is, where it comes from, and what it does to you. As we mentioned, the muscimol in fly agaric could be potentially pleasurable for its users. However, it is mixed with a neurotoxin, which is not so ideal for the user. The amount of ibotenic acid can be reduced though, either through chemical isolation or by processing the fungi material. We're going to discuss the use of the mushroom in its processed form, or as an extract. For medical or unregulated use, you might see pure muscimol being sold, but that's not what I'm going to discuss in this section. There are a few ways to reduce the amount of ibotenic acid present. If you recall our earlier discussion about piss drinking, you may have figured out why it was done. The first person or reindeer processes the mix of compounds, metabolizes the ibotenic acid into muscimol and other non-toxic compounds, and pisses out a muscimol-rich elixir. The psychedelic yellow snow will truly reign supreme. For us mere mortals though, there are logistically easier ways to process Amanita Muscaria. One method I found on Erowid simply involves drying the mushrooms in an oven and basting the escaping juices back over the mushroom material. Does this actually work? Well, I found a Japanese study from the 90s indicates that ibotenic acid was converted into muscimol when sun-dried in front of a heater. However, the study indicates that heated drying of the mushroom is not a perfect way to remove ibotenic acid, and the amount remaining can change dramatically based on your methodology. Mushrooms sun-dried for a week or more could get the ibotenic acid concentration down to about 10% of the original number. Drying wasn't really an effective measure until temperatures of 80 C were used, which matches the 170 to 190 Fahrenheit mentioned in the Erowid report. Even then though, 17% of ibotenic acid still remained. This was after 4 hours of drying. When they were dried at 120 C for 4 hours, the concentration fell below 1% of the original amount. All of this is to say that crudely processed plant material via an oven or an animal can make the mushroom safer, but typically does not remove all of the ibotenic acid. Still, some kind of heat treatment, perhaps with an added acid to aid in decomposition, has typically been the method of choice. To get a better idea as to what these trips are like, I'm going to steal some Erowid reports, as I have not done this one myself. This user made mushroom tea by steeping in boiling water for 10 minutes. Based on how short the heat exposure was, it's likely this user consumed a lot of ibotenic acid. They used various amounts of 3 different mushroom caps, dosed at 8 p.m., 9:30 p.m., and 11:30 p.m., and they estimated they consumed 7 to 9 grams. I'll provide the full report in the description, but I'll summarize this here for brevity. He describes that the world is pulsing with energy, expanding and contracting, and that colors and light are intense and vivid. He's experiencing some mild twitching, and this could be potentially due to residual ibotenic acid agonizing the glutamate system. But overall, he feels invincible, and overall very good. He says he feels the strength of God in his muscles, and that God has provided them this mushroom to share in his consciousness. The user describes having a peak religious experience, and that they can imagine how ancient people taking this mushroom must have felt. After this, 5 to 6 hours after their first dose, he begins convulsing more severely, and is worried that his heart will be affected. This passes though without incident. He describes spending large periods of time swaying, and seeing small dots in the air in front of him that he described as electrons. He stated he generally felt quite impaired, and was happy he did not take more than he did. Overall, he found the experience almost entirely pleasant, with little to no fear, and plans to take the rest of his available mushroom at some other point. Also, it's worth noting that he mentions early in the report that he did not drink any of his piss as a form of redosing, because I guess with Amanita Muscaria, you have to mention that you did not drink your piss, and it is not assumed. This report is somewhat psychedelic in nature, especially with the visual pulsing and the feeling of being connected to God's consciousness. It's curious to see the wide range of effects this user felt, and I believe that some of it is due to residual ibotenic acid. I tried to find a trip report where the material was processed more thoroughly to get a better description of pure muscimol usage. I found one where the plant was properly decarboxylated. About 80% of it was just this man describing his interesting sexual escapade with his wife. Again, themes of piss guzzling and golden showers loom large. I've decided not to share this with the audience, and I'm not going to put this on the description, but if you go to Erowid, you can definitely find it. It'll make itself very apparent. Finally, one man attempted to make a nearly pure muscimol solution by letting his mushroom material sit in DSMO, an organic compound that would provide almost 100% conversion of ibotenic acid into muscimol. I briefly looked through some literature, and it does seem like DSMO dramatically increases the conversion, so his science does check out. The user described the experience as a thick calmness in his body, with a strong alcohol-like buzz but with a clear head. He felt hypnotic, or sleepy effects, and a distortion in his peripheral vision. He didn't go into too much detail, and stated an intention to try this method on a higher dose. This report feels closer to what we would expect from an extremely strong GABA agonist, and this could be because he took a fairly pure muscimol solution with very little, if any, ibotenic acid. However, the dose used here was small, so perhaps some of the other more hallucinogenic effects would have become apparent with a larger dose. Another man tried it in front of a heater for 2 days, and found the experience to be a very relaxing tonic, and described things as looking a little bit more alive, but nothing acutely psychedelic. Again, this method of processing ibotenic acid was likely quite effective due to the duration, and that might be why we're not seeing any twitching or vomiting or symptoms like that. And I'm cherry picking trip reports, so please don't treat this as a rigorous dissertation on what compounds in Amanita Muscaria are causing what. This is kind of just a hunch. It's my speculation based on the mechanisms of both compounds and the effects I'm seeing. With that in mind, what does a bad trip look like? I'm not going to go into individual reports here, but most of them share a few common themes. There's often some kind of nausea or vomiting, a stimulated feeling, and often some twitching. But above all, there seems to be this profound sense of delirium in these bad trips. Being stuck in time loops, not knowing what's going on around you or in your body, scary things like that. Some of this is certainly dose dependent, but it does seem to be a theme that in bad trips the mushroom was not processed or processed very lightly. Again, this could suggest that ibotenic acid is playing a role. This is just a small cross-section of user experiences. There are scientific case reports and other trip reports on places like Reddit, but hopefully this provides a basic idea of what an Amanita trip can look like. These effects can vary greatly depending on the preparation of the fungal material and the dose you ingest. They cover a huge range from, oh, it's like being drunk, but a little cleaner, to I communed with God. So there's a lot of variation there. So we've discussed personal and recreational use, but what about medical use? Medical use is in the title of the video that you clicked on, right? So what does that look like? Well, there is potential medical use for Amanita muscaria, or at the very least for muscimol. Ibotenic acid is unlikely to ever be a drug in the conventional sense because brain lesions are not something the FDA is particularly fond of. That will sink your drug very easily, in fact. Muscimol is GABAergic, and there are plenty of drugs that work on GABA. But GABA tends to be an effective target for a wide range of disease states. But GABAergic compounds are often habit-forming or sedating. Withdrawal from GABAergics can also cause seizures and death, like in the case of severe alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal. In overdose, drugs that act on GABA can cause death via respiratory depression. It's one of the reasons that alcohol has a lot of dangerous interactions with many other sedative-type drugs. But GABAergics do tend to work, which is more than can be said about many CNS drugs, so the medical community is always on the lookout for better GABA agonists or modulators that can relieve symptoms with less risk of abuse or death. Most of the research done on muscimol has been done in a preclinical model, meaning it's been tested on mice or rats typically. So while the animal research may suggest that muscimol may be useful for some diseases, you can't take preclinical research at face value. It turns out that rats are not good at telling you how they're feeling, and preclinical data on rodents in the CNS space is often hard to translate to humans. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's discuss a review article in the Korean Journal of Pain. They reviewed studies testing muscimol in animals for neuropathic pain, with all of the studies being on rats or mice. Different dosage forms were used, as well as different routes of administration. They found it was effective in the treatment of mechanical hyperglasia, which is an increased sensation of pain when pressure is applied to the skin, which is according to Google. I am not a doctor. The same for thermal hyperglasia, which, as you might guess, is a pain reaction to a level of heat that should not be painful. So maybe some lukewarm temperature, but it causes significant pain. And this is just a review article on some of the rat studies. And as the article mentions, many of them are low quality. This paper just kind of aggregated the data to see what the data suggested, which isn't an uncommon way of determining effectiveness. you often have a lot of studies, and some might have somewhat contradicting information. So doing a good review of the literature to try and get the net picture is very common in the pharmaceutical world. But surprisingly, for such a powerful compound, the clinical research, both preclinical and human clinical research, is very thin on the ground. Because really the pivotal issue here, or one of them surrounding muscimol and whether you can use it as a drug, is it addictive? When regulators, doctors, anyone look at something like this with a sedative, alcohol-like profile, action on GABA receptors, is it addictive is going to really be the big question. When I think of things to get you addicted, drugs that affect 3 different receptor groups are going to jump out at me. Opioids, GABAergics, and dopaminergics. And this isn't all-encompassing. If we look at a list of addictive drugs or scheduled drugs, not that all scheduled drugs are addictive, you'll see some representatives from these groups, like Oxycontin, Xanax, right, for the GABAergics, and amphetamine, despite being admittedly a little based. Muscimol, as we mentioned, is a potent GABAergic at the GABA-A receptor, so at a glance it might seem a little bit risky, but things are rarely that simple, and we have some preclinical data we can look at for some hints on how addictive it might be. Now, as we go through this, try and remember that dependence and addiction are not the same thing. It's perfectly possible muscimol may cause tolerance and withdrawal symptoms without being addictive. That's the logic behind why SSRIs are technically not addictive, even though you might have hell getting off of them. But opioids and amphetamines are. This study on benzodiazepines at the GABA-A receptor also has some information on muscimol and claims that muscimol is not addictive, but that it does result in dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, which is often associated with addiction. However, this is dose dependent and only occurs at lower muscimol doses. Higher muscimol doses inhibit this dopaminergic firing. This is the opposite of what is seen when doses of benzos are increased, and suggests that the addictive potential of muscimol is in fact lower than that for benzos, right? Because if you take more of it and you have higher dopamine release, then that encourages additional use, right? And you end up in a cycle of addiction. But if muscimol truly begins to inhibit that firing at higher doses, it kind of has a negative feedback loop, right, that helps to prevent addiction. And this is all in theory in preclinical models. Who knows how it will work in humans, but this is suggestive data. Now let's get into the most controversial aspect of Amanita muscaria, which I believe is going to become much more controversial as the weeks and months roll on, and that is the unregulated sale of it, because as we mentioned, this is not a controlled substance for now. So you can sell it. You can even, to a certain extent, you can sell it to people. You can't claim it's food, as we'll get into later, but you can sell it without restriction. The DEA is not going to be knocking on your door. And this is somewhat unique. It is a very psychoactive mushroom. And we look at, psilocybin mushrooms, right, which are psychoactive in a different way, but still psychoactive. They are very illegal. So this puts them in a very interesting position, which I refer to as CBD hell. Now, why do I call it CBD hell? That's in reference to CBD, or cannabidiol, which has been unregulated since the 2018 Farm Bill in the US. And CBD, like fly agaric, is not considered to be a dietary supplement. And why is that important? Why would it being a supplement matter? Well, because dietary supplements have to conform to good manufacturing practices. They are not drugs, but their manufacture is controlled by the FDA. The plants that are making them have to register with the FDA, and they have to keep up some pretty thorough manufacturing standards. And that means producers of supplements are usually creating pure, well-identified products. You have to analyze them. You have to know what's in your final supplement. The FDA does not believe that CBD is safe enough to be a supplement, because to be a supplement, you can just sell to people in a way not dissimilar to an OTC drug, but a little bit different. It has to be pretty safe, right? But because it's not a supplement, it's in this strange limbo where it's not regulated, but anyone can make it and sell it. And the only stipulation is that you can't put it into food for humans or animals. It can't be food, and you can't make medical claims about it, which is true for, anything that's not an FDA-approved drug. You cannot make a claim for medical benefit. So that means that people often buy adulterated or impure CBD products that might have other substances in them, because no one's watching, no one's inspecting the plants. In the case of CBD, this is only really moderately unsafe, For the most part, like maybe there'd be a trace of THC or less CBD than they advertise on the label. And that's not great. You're not getting what's in the label. It's not great. In rare cases, it can be unsafe, but typically it's not really a big threat to public health. Amanita muscaria is typically not lethal, like we said, but as you can imagine, it is not as innocuous as CBD. You probably don't want to be taking an extract from a mushroom like this unless you have some way to verify that you are taking pure muscimol. That's not to say muscimol is completely safe or completely without risk, but a pure muscimol product would be safer than a mislabeled fly agaric extract of dubious composition. A recent paper was published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine imploring for regulatory action to be taken on the sale of Amanita muscaria. The article's tone is, to be honest, a little whiny for my taste, but it has some super interesting information in it. For one, use of Amanita muscaria had remained fairly steady over the years, until online vendors began selling it and its extracts. In the last 2 years, Google searches for it have more than doubled, as it has become more well known. While this video was being made, but after the script was written, the FDA made a press release stating that Amanita muscaria and its components are not authorized as food additives. It's an interesting read, but basically it's telling companies that produce Amanita chocolate bars, oils, etc. to eat shit. Also, I'm going to discuss diamond shrooms and their website, but while I was making this video and taking my sweet time, the website was nuked, so you're going to have to just trust me on everything I'm claiming about it. So one example of impure products causing serious issues is that aforementioned company Diamond Shrooms, which made mushroom microdose products with muscimol in them, which is an interesting concept. This is going to make you feel something very strong, but also it's a microdose. Doesn't really make sense on its surface anyway. The FDA cracked down on them particularly hard after there were reports of seizures, CNS depression, agitation, abnormal heart rates, nausea, and vomiting. On their website, they have the following statement: due to consumers being ill after consuming the entire chocolate bar and some products containing higher levels of muscimol than normal, it is crucial that all of our customers refrain from ingesting this product while we, alongside the FDA, continue our investigation as to what is the cause of these serious adverse effects. This wording makes it seem like the issue was too much muscimol, but this doesn't really check out. Apparently the product was causing seizures, and that's strange because muscimol is an anti-epileptic in animal models, right? Which makes sense, as it is, a GABAergic, right? It's similar in how it affects seizures to benzodiazepines or other drugs that slow down that neurotransmission. You know what compound does cause seizures, though? I know I've said this an irritating amount of times, but you should know what's coming. It's ibotenic acid. I tried to find their labs, quote unquote, on their website, and the results I found looked pretty weird. Maybe I'm reading these wrong, but it seems like muscimol and ibotenic acid were below the limit of quantification, meaning that there was almost none of either. This begs a different question. What the fuck were they even selling then? They talk ad nauseum about microdosing and the uplifting and euphoric effects that will come with it, but based on their own analysis, there's nothing in the chocolates. That's likely because the labs were probably either performed badly or were fraudulent. I'm not the FDA, I'll never know the full story, but my educated guess is that there was too much ibotenic acid present and they poisoned a lot of people. So you really don't want to be taking these extracts or chocolates or gummies unless you are extremely sure of their purity, and even then I would proceed with great caution. These online stores are attempting to take advantage of the new psychedelic wave, and they are often of dubious moral integrity, so you should always tread carefully when purchasing something from them. You might even be better off getting actual mushrooms and just processing it extremely carefully yourself, because at least then you'll know what's in your product. And I'm not endorsing the use, it's from a harm reduction purpose. Your own product that you handle is better than a shady little pop-up company that doesn't care if you live or die. Now, I'm not for banning this, or really any other plant compound, but I do think that manufacturing regulations should be in place. Unfortunately, with our current framework, that's just impossible. If you want to try this mushroom, please use proper harm reduction practices, or just drink some piss, I guess. Be highly skeptical of people who are attempting to profiteer off of an incredible natural product. You don't know what they're putting in those little chocolates, and their labs cannot be trusted either. Now, when I wrote this, there was not available data on the labs produced by the company in question. But since then, because I took so fucking long, the FDA actually released their own lab findings, which was a pleasant surprise. So now we can compare my guesses to the actual conclusions, and I did not do so well. So in what way did I get this wrong? Was I being too harsh? Nope, I actually was not being harsh enough. These things were significantly more fucked up than I could have anticipated. So the FDA noted that they used a raw ingredient that contained muscimol and ibotenic acid, which is what we had assumed, right, Amanita Muscaria. But contrary to my expectations, no ibotenic acid showed up in the FDA's testing. Instead, they found psilocybin, which I probably pronounced incorrectly, but that is a prodrug for psilocin. And if you want to know what psilocin is, it is what gives you the actual high of a magic mushroom, right? Psilocybin turns into psilocin in your body, which is the actual active drug. So this is kind of similar to psilocybin in that you ingest it, it turns into psilocin, right? It's in a sense, it is a more powerful psilocybin. The FDA also found plain old psilocin, because why leave anything to chance, right? They also found pregabalin, which is a prescription drug used for neuropathic pain and anxiety. It's similar to gabapentin. It's kind of like a stronger version of gabapentin. And there are also several hard to pronounce compounds from the kava plant, which is known for alcohol-like intoxicating effects as well. And some of them did also have muscimol, so I guess they at least process out their ibotenic acid. Good for them, along with adulterating their products. Although considering everything else, it wouldn't surprise me if they use like real piss in this. So why am I posting my L here? I mean, yeah, some of it's laziness because I don't want to rewrite the script, but also I do want to highlight how adulterated these products can be. I put my brain and my room temperature IQ to this conundrum for a solid amount of time, and I wasn't even close to guessing the literal pharmacy these products were contaminated with. As much as we joke, several people actually died from these. These products you buy online or at the gas station aren't all that different from something you might buy off a friend of a friend. There is little oversight when it comes to these products, and the feds can't be everywhere at once. Do not trust all labs you see online. Do not buy products claiming to have drug-like things in them unless you are certain you know their composition. Also, anyone who adulterates products sold to unwitting consumers should be lined up against a wall and shot. People take these products for relief and put their trust in the manufacturer, who is more than happy to poison them. This behavior is disgusting, and I do not believe there is a punishment severe enough for people like that. Anyway, I know it's a bit of a tangent, and my example technically does not support my original point, but you can see how theoretically ibotenic acid could very easily get into these Amanita Muscaria based products and cause serious harm. This product isn't exclusive to Amanita products, but it does seem to be worse for Amanita products than, say, cannabinoid oils or gummies. Anyway, thank you for watching. This was a bit of a long video, and it took me a while to make with work and school and everything else I have going on. I will not dox myself, but hopefully you got something out of it. If you want to drink piss and roll in the snow, please like and subscribe, I guess. This has been Staircase. Thank you for watching.